Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming here to CSIS. I'm glad to see there's also a large group of students in the room. Want to raise your hands? Yeah, that's great. Wow. Wow. I'm Debra McCarthy. I'm the executive director of a new program that we have here at CSIS to bring diverse voices and diverse perspectives to discussions of foreign affairs. It's a result of a partnership between the International Career Advancement Program Alumni Association, ICAP-AA for short, and CSIS. And we have some amazing donors who are committed to this effort that we want to thank. The panel we have today is fantastic. It'll challenge you, bring new thoughts, and provoke new questions. Our moderator, Beverly Kirk, is well known to many of you as the program manager of Smart Women, Smart Power, plus 4 other incarnations here at CSIS. She's also a member of ICAP-AA and was instrumental in getting this whole program going. So please enjoy.
Thank you so much, Debra, and thank you to everyone joining us here and online, and to viewers on C-SPAN. As Debra mentioned, I'm Beverly Kirk. I'm a fellow here at CSIS in the International Security Program, and I manage the Smart Women, Smart Power initiative. And full disclosure, I spent more than 2 decades as a journalist. In fact, most of that time was here in Washington, and I've actually worked with 3 of the 4 people who are sitting here on the stage. And so let me introduce them to you. To my immediate left is Jeff Ballou. Jeff Ballou is the 110th president of the National Press Club. He is the first African-American man and the first representative of an international media organization to hold that post. Jeff is the news editor at Al Jazeera Media Network and is part of its global editorial leadership team. He helped to establish the English channel back in 2006. He is a DuPont, Peabody, Murrow, and Emmy award-winning journalist who's previously worked at C-SPAN, NPR, and local DC stations, WAMU, WTOP, and Fox 5 DC, which is where I met him. Next to him is Diana Marrero, the director of The Hill Latino, and it is a new media platform that she helped to launch that's focused on Latino public affairs. And before shifting to the business side of the media, she was an award-winning journalist, beginning her career at the Miami Herald, where she was part of a team that covered the Elian Gonzalez International Custody battle, thank you. And she also served as the acting Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, USA Today, and the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. She's the founder and past president of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. So welcome, Diana. Thank you. Next to her is Rosalind Jordan. Rosalind is the United Nations correspondent for Al Jazeera, and she's previously covered the State Department and the Pentagon for Al Jazeera. Previously, she covered the White House for NBC News, as well as Tribune Broadcasting. She was nominated for an Emmy for her work on NBC's 2004 presidential election night coverage, and she won a Regional Associated Press award for her reporting on the U.S. immigration debate. And I worked with her at NBC. Next to her is Eric Ham, a political analyst for the BBC, SiriusXM, The Hill, and he has also contributed to CNN. He has been a senior contributor at Arise News, and he is a former Hill staffer. He was a key advisor to Senator Bill Nelson and the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was also the author of a book called The GOP Civil War, Inside the Battle for the Soul of the Republican Party. And I also want to give a special shout out to Eric, as this is a homecoming for him. He was previously Director of Congressional Affairs here at CSIS. So welcome home.
Thank you.
We have a saying here at CSIS, you never really leave. It's kind of like the Hotel California. You go work other places, but you're always a CSISer. So let's get started with the question at hand about the geopolitical impact of the Fourth Estate. And I want to start with the issue of trust, because that is an issue that is certainly ever present. And I want to know what you think about what happens when people feel like the information that they are getting, they're questioning whether they can believe it, particularly as that concerns global issues, global hotspots. Jeff?
Well, I think trust is paramount, because once you lose the trust, you can't trust the information. And as it relates to the Fourth Estate, a lot of, as you can tell in the current arena, there's a lot of challenges to the profession, a lot of people engaging in Twitter trolling and a whole range of interesting behavior. I'll nicely characterize it.
Please, it's PG
yeah.
TV.
But what it gets down to is this: if you have the leader of the free world spending days, weeks, months, for 18 months leading into a presidency, denouncing the press, which is an intricate part of the Constitution itself, you're not only undermining trust in the Fourth Estate, you're undermining trust in the Constitution itself. And when you do that, that undermines trust in the other institutions in a country. And if the United States is supposed to be the beacon for democracy and free expression and freedom of the press, then other despots elsewhere in the world say, see, the President of the United States can do it, we can do it too, and they do. And so therefore, it's a scary situation in the sense that it not only puts journalists in danger, it puts your information in a place where it can be created by people who don't have their people's best interest at hand in countries that aren't up to snuff in terms of having stable environments, having safe streets, having anything that resembles a sense of safety and security to move about and to even feel that they can question their representatives. And if they can't do it here, then you're left to you're left to your own devices, and that's chaos. That could lead to chaos.
Diana?
I come at this from a political standpoint. I work for a political newspaper, and it's interesting to see, how that divides around partisan lines as well. So there have been surveys that show that, Democrats versus Republicans are actually less likely to trust news sources than Democrats are. So it's a really interesting dynamic that's happening. The Columbia Journalism Review put out a study around the time of the election looking at the folks who were retweeting tweets from Clinton versus Trump, and then what media sources they were using and retweeting themselves. And they put out a really fantastic bubble chart that looked at, basically it was a proxy for Democrats, Republicans, and how much do they trust certain media institutions. And you'll see places like the Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, all organizations that should be trusted, that are mainstream, that are credible, really discarded by half the population. And it was really striking to see that. And then on the other end, looking at places like Breitbart News being trusted and retweeted by the right, but not, obviously not by the left. What I feel good about is being at the Hill. I work at a place that's very nonpartisan, that comes at it from a very straightforward perspective. And we were excited to see we were right in the middle. So we were this big green ball in the middle. We were actually the most trusted news source by both the Democrats and Republicans. But one other thing I'll say about trust is that this is across the board. It's not just a news phenomenon. If you look at surveys, there's a lack of trust in institutions globally. I mean, the church, government, you could go down the line, companies. People are just not trusting major institutions that for many, many years had held that trust of consumers and the public.
Rosalind, you're out in the field reporting on issues.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make sure that people trust what you're telling them?
Well, I keep in mind that from the very beginning of the United States, there has always been suspicion of a free press. Let's not forget, we once had the Alien and Sedition Acts, in which criticizing political figures for their behavior could land you in prison. And it was bipartisan. Politicians don't like to be held to account. So I keep that in mind when I'm trying to do my work. What I say to people who try to challenge my work is, look at my sourcing. Look at how I characterize the information. Was I accurate? Was I fair? Did I give all sides the credence? Did I present a skeptical view where it was necessary? One of the things that we have to remember about working in the media is that it's a two-way street. We collect the information, we present the information, we analyze the information, but it is incumbent upon the public, the readers, the listeners, the viewers, the people who engage with us on social media, to actually think about what they're seeing and hearing and reading. Use your critical faculties. Be skeptical. Ask your own questions. Don't just take what Al Jazeera puts out, or what the BBC puts out, or what CNN puts out, or what any number of newspapers, because newspapers are still very much a vibrant part of our political culture. Don't just take what is being published as the gospel truth. Ask your own questions. Ask whether the people presenting the information have a track record of actually showing you what's happening, or if they have a record of trying to pull a fast one on you. You can't be a passive consumer. And I hate that word because it's such a business word. But you can't be a passive consumer of the news. And this is my personal view. Being an informed person is being a good citizen, particularly in the United States, which has the First Amendment. And so when people say, well, what about this? I will say, take a look at these stories. I will say, take a look at what I actually said. Tell me what you're really objecting to. Then we can have a conversation. So that's usually how I diffuse it. I end up, taking it right back to the person and saying, okay, you took the time to actually reach out to me and say, I have an issue with what you reported. Let's talk about it. Do you have insight that maybe I overlooked? Inform me. That's my job. I get paid to learn something every day and then to share it with everyone else. But you have to do it every single day. There's a story, or there's a line, you're only as good as your last story. In this climate, you're only as good as your body of work. And if you make a mistake, people will hold you accountable. But I challenge journalists to hold our readers and listeners and viewers accountable as well. Are you engaging with us in good faith? Or are you simply looking for someone to reflect your personal opinion? I'm not here for that. You can call your mom.
Okay. And Eric, you come at this from a little bit of a different spin. You do analysis.
Right.
How do you make sure people trust your analysis?
Well, that's a really interesting point, and because what I try to focus, and I try to stay away from the partisanship, because so many people are looking for that. A lot of people want to know who's up, who's down, and I'm always asked, are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? And I try to tell them that we try to stay away from that, and we're just looking at what the impact is of the action, the policy that we're addressing right now, and what that will mean for multiple audiences in different groups. And also, too, when we look at the Fourth Estate, if I could just go into this, coming from the standpoint of having worked in one of the three branches of government in Congress, we see when I was there, we saw the Fourth Estate as sacrosanct. It was an independent body. It was a free press, but it was something that we felt that was important to how democracy works, and that it was also a tool that we could use, not in terms of actually propaganda or anything like that, but actually getting out the message in terms of what the work is that we're doing, what issues that we're focusing on, what legislation we're trying to pass, what we're trying to do, particularly in terms of funding for, at the time when I was in Congress, the Iraq War was at an all-time high, and we were really engaged in that. And so we were focusing on trying to make sure that people knew about how we were trying to provide for our troops, how we were trying to engage in the war. And so we want to try to get that message out. And also, too, one thing that I can say as a contributor for The Hill in terms of actually writing, what I have found is when I write about stories of international interest, unfortunately, I don't get as many eyeballs, I don't get as many comments or much feedback on those types of stories. And it just seems that, I don't know, I guess maybe it's because we're living in such a heightened political environment right now, but when you write about the who's up, who's down, you know, in terms of the politics, that's when people really seem to get engaged. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us in the media to really try to break through that and really focus on trying to educate and try to bring our audiences along. Because what we want to do is we want to try to, I think, take them to higher ground and not reach to the lowest common denominator.
You raise a really interesting point about international news and our attention and appetite for it. And we were talking back in the green room about how things are covered here in the US versus how international media organizations, which all of you have experience with, cover that. So we'll jump to that topic. How are international news outlets affecting or impacting coverage here in the US? I ask this not necessarily from a political perspective, but I know that when I watch the BBC, or when I watch Al Jazeera, or when I watch France 24, the story lineup and the issues that are covered are often very different than what I see when I watch CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, ABC, NBC, CBS. So if you guys could talk about the difference there.
I would say probably not nearly as much of an impact as we would hope. We were talking before about the political crisis in Venezuela. You know, when one of our senior correspondents, our Latin American editor, can get in and can get a visa, she will go in to report. But if the Venezuelan government doesn't give our crews visas, they have to sit on the border in Colombia and watch people come across and basically scavenge to keep themselves and their families alive while the political crisis plays itself out. And you would think the US networks would want to be there. This is, you know, human suffering, this is political crisis, you know, all of the elements of drama, of tension, and a political figure who, for better or worse, is considered a bogeyman here in Washington. Can't break through. Story can't break through. And cynically, I think it would take some mass casualty, people losing their lives before the US media would actually invest time and people are expensive, to actually cover the political crisis in Venezuela. Yemen, no one can get in. You know, it's an active war zone. The Saudis really control the access. The UN does not have the ability to take reporters in with it right now. We've already asked because of the ongoing cholera epidemic. So we have to cover around the edges. But again, because the US is not actively, directly involved in the conflict, it is supporting the Saudis, but because the US is not leading this war, very little presence, certainly on the airwaves. You'll see stories in the Times and in the Post, but if you want better reporting, then you're going to have to start reading The Guardian, The Independent, start reading Middle East newspapers, but you're not going to find it whole scale in a typical U.S. newspaper.
Right. You know, and also just with the Qatar crisis, and you know, I'm actually speaking on that issue on air practically every day, either for BBC or for Sky News, and I don't see any U.S. Media companies actually really engaging and speaking about it. But it's something that it's an ongoing issue, and it's something that many audiences outside of the U.S. are deeply engaged and concerned about. And there's such a huge demand with BBC and Sky News to really not only address it and talk about it, but they want to know what is the U.S. role in the crisis, and what's the U.S. policy, what's the U.S. position, what is Donald Trump, what is the president going to do to try to address this issue. And so it's something that they're covering en masse, but it's also something that they're desperately looking for the United States and the United States engagement and what is the U.S. position on these issues. Any international issue that's ongoing, you have, and I think maybe one of the advantages to being an American, I shouldn't say that. That sounds pretty bad, right? There's just so many advantages to being American. But anyway, but I think there's so much.
Passport is a good thing.
There is a huge demand, there's a huge thirst and appetite for international media outlets looking for that U.S. voice and looking for someone who can speak coherently to what the U.S. role is and explain it and break it down to those audiences, those particular audiences, and I think that's so key right now. And we don't see, I think, American media outlets addressing the issues and speaking to traditional American audiences about what's going on with the rest of the world.
And Diana,
to your point. I just wanted to add, to your point. I just came back from 2 weeks in the Middle East covering the diplomatic crisis. I didn't see any of my fellow American reporters until Rex Tillerson left the president's trip in Europe and flew to Kuwait City for a week of shuttle diplomacy. And then because the Secretary of State isn't carrying a big media contingent as previous secretaries have done, people had to fly in domestically and were holed up in random hotels around the city and couldn't really get access to meetings because they were all closed door. But that was the one moment that you saw the Washington Post and the New York Times and the TV networks paying more than 3 seconds attention to something that directly affects the U.S.'s national security interests.
Right.
Every war that the U.S. is running is out of its forward operating base at Al Udeid Air Base in Doha. And yet, we can't get coverage of what 11,000 U.S. forces are doing in Doha in the U.S. media otherwise. So, you have to consider also what's the trigger. When the Secretary of State goes, it becomes automatically an important story.
Right.
Diana, I want to talk to you about this specifically because you noted that most Latino Americans get their news in English language from English language media outlets.
Right.
And yet, on any given night, you watch English language media outlets and you don't hear anything about Venezuela, as Rosalind noted. And you don't hear much else about what's happening in their countries of origin in many cases, or what's going on in the Latino community within the U.S., unless it has something to do with immigration. That's all you ever hear about, but that's not the whole story. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, coming at it from a U.S.-based newspaper perspective that is national in nature, that covers politics, last year, I launched The Hill Latino, which is an online portal aimed at U.S. Latinos who live here, who are primarily English speakers. The vast majority of Hispanics in the U.S. actually speak English, consume their news in English, but there's very little attention being devoted to news that speaks to them and that covers the issues that they care about. As you noted, many of them either are immigrants themselves, the children of immigrants, and then have a vested interest in stories on Mexico, Venezuela, Cuba. Puerto Rico aren't immigrants, but obviously they care about what's happening on the island as well. So there is a dearth of attention being paid by U.S.-based news outlets to those issues. And I think we're writing at The Hill for a very influential audience. Our core audience are these decision makers in Washington. It's the president, it's the members of Congress, their staffers who are reading The Hill to do their jobs. And I'm proud of the fact that we've brought more international attention or more issues of international importance to that audience through the Latino lens. So we've written quite a bit, obviously, about immigration because you can't get away from that, but we've written a lot about trade and the crisis in Puerto Rico. In fact, we had a special report. We were, I think, the only US-based newspaper that had an entire section devoted to the crisis in Puerto Rico and what was happening there.
And for
it
people
was
who aren't familiar with the crisis in Puerto Rico, can you do a quick
right.
refresher?
I mean, it's going into a complete economic tailspin. People are leaving in droves because they don't have jobs. It is a U.S. territory, so all Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens who can easily come to the U.S., and they have, to find better economic opportunities. And it's a huge story that very few people are covering. And we devoted an entire section to it. We've obviously covered it throughout, but we devoted one day where we spent a lot of time writing about this issue. And in fact, it was interesting because talking about, all news is global, and Nuevo Dia, which is a leading newspaper in Puerto Rico, actually ended up reporting on the fact that a U.S. newspaper had reported on Puerto Rico because it was such a unique thing that no one was paying attention to. So it's just an interesting perspective.
Yeah. In fact, just to sort of tie those last 2 points together, what Eric and you were raising, what you have in U.S. newsrooms is if it doesn't matter to me, if it doesn't have if it's not landing on my front doorstep, I don't care. Or I may care, but I don't have the resources, because there are definitely economic factors to this, as Rosalind alluded to. But what is missing is those valuable perspectives. I mean, we've at the Press Club for more than a century, we've hosted people from all manner of political perspectives and walks of life. We had one of the leading contenders running for the Mexican presidency, and there was, media from all over, Latin America, packed in the press room, but you couldn't find a U.S.-based camera to save your life in the room. But when General Dunford shows up, hey, everybody's in the room, and you just kind of say, what's going on here? Because this is your neighbor to the south. There's it was a vigorous campaign for the presidency, and yet you're not in the room to hear about how this leading contender may deal with NAFTA, since President Trump has talked about renegotiating that and all those other critical issues, and we lose when you don't have when we don't have a seat at the table. And you don't have when Americans, at least if you want to be parochial about it, if Americans don't have a seat at the table and a window into what's going on, then you're not informed, and that's sad.
Is it because Americans aren't interested, or is it perhaps that, at least in some parts of America, access to news outlets like Al Jazeera or The Hill Latino or the BBC is limited or non-existent?
Well, you have to make the decision of what is important to cover and bringing into people's living rooms in the 24-hour news cycle. If you decide that covering the crisis in Venezuela is important, then they're going to pay attention to it. But if they don't have the foresight to connect the dots, to say, like Rosalind was talking about, if you've got one of the largest forward operating bases full of American troops, and you don't care until the Secretary of State shows up, and on what complicates that, and Rosalind sort of, I want to dig a little into the whole notion that the Secretary of State has a very low opinion of journalists, where he barely keeps a handful of us in the plane, and has been known for leaving us behind and those other things. I mean, you have to care about the issue, and you have to push harder and dare to be in the room so that people can be informed. But if you can't connect A to Z, and of course the economic factor in commercial television is that people want to have, it's sponsored.
You read my mind. That was my very next question.
You're talking about a sponsored enterprise, and if sponsors don't care about these issues and the eyeballs, then you're not going to have the resources to deploy the people to cover the issues that people should be caring about.
And then there's also the infrastructure issue. If you don't have broadband for television, for internet access, You can't watch Al Jazeera on basic cable in the US. Right now we're only online. So if you don't have broadband, you're not going to see this beautiful HD video and all of the luscious graphics and the photography that my colleagues carry out. Because if you have regular dial-up, you'll never get the signal. You're never going to be able to access what Diana and her colleagues are doing on their website. You know, all of the added extra material, the conversations, the extra content, animation if you put it on, because dial-up can't accommodate it. And there's so many parts in this country that are rural, that are in the back country, that don't have broadband access. And the irony is that cable was invented for people who live outside of big cities. If you can't access the work that people are doing, you just won't know. I mean, it's not a question of whether or not you're interested, you can't even get the basic information. And that's a problem.
It's a tough question because you look at Google's internet searches, right? And you look at what Americans are searching for in terms of countries. And it's primarily domestic. It's you know, Western Europe when it is outside of the country. They're Googling Mexico, but you know, I don't know that there is an interest, and I don't know what comes first. Is it that the fact that the media, domestic media, is not covering these international issues makes it that the news consumers care less because they're getting less of that information? Or is it the other way around, that, you know, these news industries are catering to the needs and wants of these consumers who don't care about international news for the most part?
But for many people in smaller towns, their eye on the world comes to them through their local television station. And if you factor in the economics of having reporters who cover the local issues, you perhaps pay for access to other news organizations to get information from around the world, but most local news stations have limited budgets in order to bring in the world writ large.
I would actually question that, because even if you, and Rosalind, you travel extensively, but I think oftentimes when you go to different places, you may meet people, and it's amazing how internationally savvy they are. So many people know so much, especially about what's going on here, or about many of the issues that are driving, I think, the geopolitical landscape. And so we don't often see that here, but also I think given that we now have a 24-hour news cycle, and that's something that I think is global. And so that's a lot of ground to cover. And trust me, you know, wearing so many different media hats, you know, my day oftentimes feels like a 24-hour news cycle.
Right.
But to push back on that just a little bit, I'm from rural America, full disclosure, and where I grew up, broadband right now in 2017, if I want full access to it, I have to drive 10 miles from where my family home is into the little town to have broadband access so that my smartphone works and can download Al Jazeera and The Hill Latino. And the economics, I bring that back up, it's not that people there aren't interested, they're interested, but if it requires a 10-mile drive from your house to go to the local library where broadband is free for you to make your smartphone work, that's a lot of effort.
Sure.
And not everybody is going to do that to make themselves globally informed.
Right. Well, what I was getting at is that you have this enormous amount of space, and oftentimes I think maybe in the world that we're in right now, we're not necessarily, I think, utilizing that space in the most effective way possible. And by that I mean we're not actually pushing the stories that I think could be drivers to actually bring an audience along. And sometimes I think sometimes I think we really get caught up on the low-hanging fruit. You know, it's easy, you know, to focus on what's the latest tweet storm. But for example, if you look at the G20 and you look at this massive trade deal with Japan and the EU, I thought that was a really, really big deal.
Right.
And what it spoke to was, I think, the opportunities that are being missed, particularly by the United States, and how globally other countries are taking advantage of that space. And that was something that we were addressing and covering on the BBC, but I think many American media outlets weren't focusing on that. But I think it's something that was very crucial and needed to be addressed. But I just didn't. But again, I think when you look at this 24-hour news cycle, I think that's a story that could be taking up quite a bit of that, but we're just not seeing it. We've got this much space, and I think only this much bandwidth is actually being accessed and utilized.
But there are three issues that come up. One, you're talking about, and the one that Beverly raised, and that is, if I'm in a town in Kentucky, where Beverly's from, or if I'm from a part of Montana or whatever, I have to prioritize what are my key issues. Do I care more about broadband, or do I care, if I'm in a farming community, do I care more about subsidies and other things that deal with my farming or mining, coal mining in some parts of Kentucky, and things of that nature. So that's one issue. Two, if you're talking about an issue about like the G20, that's where the affiliate news services, and I used to work for one for Hubbard Broadcasting, and CONUS, and those sorts of things are incredibly important that a news service, wherever it's based, can go to the G20 and distill that issue down to the local communities where they do make the connection of why is the G20 important to me? Is it about, what does it boil down to the critical goods and services that may be unique to where my part of the world. And the third part is who's in the room making decisions, and that gets to diversity.
Great.
And it's not just racial diversity; it's geographic diversity. And if you don't have people from rural communities, if you don't have people of color in the room, if you don't have all those other factors in the room that have decision-making power, then those stories aren't going to be covered. Venezuela is not going to be covered. G20 is not going to be covered. Yemen's not going to be covered. The GCC Qatar dispute is not going to be covered. And it's definitely not going to be covered properly if you don't have those folks in the room.
I just wanted to piggyback on that. I mean, this country is becoming more diverse than ever. The white population of this country is in the just over 60% at the moment. But if you look at newsrooms across, domestically across the country, only 13% of newsrooms are actually diverse. It's a huge gulf, and I agree with you. You miss stories when you're not reflecting the communities that you're covering and that you're serving.
Well, I am sure the audience has plenty of questions. Let me state for the record, if you do have a question, please raise your hand. We have a couple of people in the back with microphones, and they will come to you. And there is this stipulation. You must ask a question. No filibustering allowed here. It's not Congress. So the first hand I saw go up was this young lady right here in the front. Wait for the mic. Tell us your name.
Oh, my name's Helena. I had a question about sources and trust. So there was a huge discussion on Twitter going on from reporters at NPR and such when the baseball shooting happened with the congressional baseball, and reporters were saying that sources weren't willing to talk to them because they were you're part of the media. So has that been a struggle that you've been seeing throughout in terms of people actually wanting to talk to reporters? Because that's a huge issue, because if you don't have sources and people who aren't willing to trust you or to talk to you, you're missing stories. So particularly in a breaking news situation. Yeah.
It's an excellent question.
Yeah.
It's not a new problem. When I was a local news reporter in Milwaukee in the mid-1990s, I was assigned a story in which someone was killed. And my job was to go to the neighborhood where this person was murdered, to try to talk to neighbors about this person, if they knew the person, about the incident. I walked up and down this street, knocked on every single door, not a single person wanted to speak to me. Not even off camera, just record the voice, record the feet, not even shoot the house. They didn't want to talk. They were scared. They were very much afraid about being punished, being attacked. being the target of retaliation if they spoke to the media. This was our lead story. I went back to the newsroom and told the assignment editor, I don't know what to do. I've knocked on every single door. You know, the photographer waited in the car so we wouldn't scare people off. No one wanted to talk. And the assignment editor said, you know what, that's your story. This is what crime does to a community. It steals people's voices. You can go back and stand on the street and say, this is what happened when we came to ask about the murder of this person. People are afraid for their own safety and they don't want to speak out. And that was the story. That was 20 years ago. That's always going to be an issue, that people don't want to talk, that they feel that their words are going to be taken out of context, that their views aren't going to be respected, that you in the media have an agenda. So it's an age-old problem. If people want to talk, they will talk. I am asking people to open up themselves, to open up their lives to me. I'm not doing them a favor by putting them on my TV channel. And I think that there is an attitude among many reporters, particularly in TV, that people should want to be on TV because I'm on TV. And that's the wrong way to approach doing your job. So when you have a lot of people out there with that attitude, it's very understandable why people who witness something horrible, such as what happened to Representative Skillies, don't want to say anything because they're afraid that their words are going to be taken out of context. So what you have to do is, sometimes if you work with the camera, sometimes you have to put the camera down, and you just have to just talk with the person, see if the person will say anything. You can then turn around and say it. Obviously, the gold standard is having the person who saw something happen say on camera, I saw this happen, because that person now has skin in the game. But it doesn't always happen. It doesn't always work that way, and your job as a journalist is to find a way to tell the story as it is, not tell the story as you think it should be told. You shouldn't be just ticking off boxes and saying, okay, I got these three sound bites, I spoke to this public official, I got this video of the scene, here's my stand-up or piece to camera, and I'm done. You're chronicling what actually is, not filling out the boxes in a formula.
But it has gotten much, much worse,
Yeah.
Especially in the political atmosphere. I was a political reporter 10 years ago and experienced it, but the level of vitriol and the level of hatred by some for the news media has just completely intensified. I mean, if you look at the way that the campaigns are covered, and you heard reporters being heckled in campaign rallies and in press conferences. Jorge Ramos from Univision was kicked out of a press conference by the president-to-be.
Well, he wasn't kicked out, he was dragged out.
Yeah, by his muscle.
So it's definitely become much, much harder to deal with for the news industry.
And there's also a couple points that sort of pull Diana's and Rosalind's points together, and it goes back to something I said earlier. And it goes to the trust issue, which is if people don't feel their communities are being covered fairly, and that's long before anybody ever heard of Donald J. Trump. They're not going to open their doors to you. If they feel that indeed what was said earlier, points taken out of context and things like that, and you add on top of that people who have over a course of time trashed the press because it was convenient to do so, to score political points. So you have that age-old history complicated with the political frosting on top of an already bad tasting cake. And so you have reporters being spat upon at political rallies covering the president, or having to be escorted out by police and things of that nature. That's what happened during this last campaign. Let's not clean it up. So we have a responsibility as journalists to get it right, but we also make sure have to have the voices in the room, and also the people who are in power, who are trusted with this responsibility, have a unique, role and power, and must use it accordingly to reinvest trust in all of the institutions. Yes, you can be a skeptic. Yes, you can want to change things, but to simply trash it has that cascading effect down to the point where people trying to cover an honest-to-God shooting are being booted away because of the old problem and the new problem on top of that. And that doesn't serve anybody, because you're trying to find out whether or not one of the leaders in Congress is going to die, whether or not, who did it, how did that come to happen, who else got hurt, and this whole vitriol gets in the way of fundamental information. Can I take my kid to that ball field on Saturday because we were thinking about having Little League? You have to think about those things.
It would be really easy, if I were queen of the world, to say to the media, now, if ever, is when you need to hire more people to do this work. And they need to be hired to work all over the country, not just in New York, Washington, and LA. But you need to put people in every state, and they need to cover that state. That's their beat. And they need to get to know people. They need to get to understand the culture. They need to get to understand the faith. They need to understand the history. They need to understand the local issues. And their job is to tell those stories, if I were queen of the world. But this is the United States, and journalism is a business. And most of the media organizations are owned by companies that have to provide quarterly dividends to their shareholders. So I can dream.
All right, other questions? Lady here.
Princess Basler Bethay with Interaction. My question is about misinformation and this idea of fake news. And I guess barring your particular jobs and your allegiances, as experts, do you think there is a possibility for a repository of just basic truth in information? And is there an ideal amongst experts that there needs to be at least one space where we can all agree and share information, and it kind of has a stamp of approval amongst experts? I know in the nonprofit sector and the charity sector, you have Charity Navigator, and you have these type of things that sort of do a broad branch of, these are valuable and valid organizations. Is there that sort of thing, or the movement towards doing that?
Well, I two points on that. One, there's beyond your local library, it's impossible to say this is the singular repository of all things true. It's just not feasible. You have a lot of organizations, the National Press Club is joined with other organizations, CPJ and others, to come together and begin this process of sorting this out, and began to try to say, okay, who's really doing the job well, who's not doing the job well, and to be able to spot falsehoods. There are collectives happening in the journalism community where we can spot falsehoods. So fact checking is definitely a really popular thing nowadays. And that's happening. So if you go to the PolitiFacts, if you go to these other repositories to see if something is true or false, generally speaking, yes, they're there, and it's growing because the need is there, because you have actors who aren't even journalists jumping into the arena pretending to be us and giving the stamp of approval by our government, by being inserted into the White House briefing room, by being inserted into Congress and elsewhere.
You want to give examples of that?
Sure. Breitbart is a perfect example of that. Gateway Pundit is a perfect example of that. These are organizations that don't practice the craft with fairness and balance, and yet for political reasons, the White House has allowed them to be credentialed in the briefing room. That should scare you.
And there are folks who would disagree with Jeff's
Of
assessment.
course, because there's a difference between conservative-leaning, in some respects, news organizations that still do call balls and strikes. I mean, there is a world of difference between Fox News and Breitbart. Let's just put it out there. And you have I would trust Fox News. I will not trust Breitbart because Breitbart has a history of doctoring video. Breitbart has a history of doctoring the facts and distort them, going back to the former Assistant Secretary of Agriculture incident, which helped put him on the map. And it turns out, making her look like I can't remember
Shirley
Sherrod, making her look like she was having a racist speech. When indeed, when you looked at the whole tape, it was nothing of the sort. It was that organization, and now they're getting credentialed, at least in some parts of this town. Thank God, my former colleagues on the Radio Television Correspondents Association Executive Committee and other standing committees on the Hill booted them away when they asked for credentials, because we have to have some standards about who's actually doing the job.
And the First Amendment is not, because of the First Amendment, it is not for the government to say, you're a legitimate news organization and you're not. It really is the ultimate free marketplace of ideas. Mm-hmm. Self-policing, I believe, is the way that we will do this, but to have a central repository for saying this is factual and this isn't factual, there are people who say that scientists, people with PhDs, people with years of research and publications and teaching under their belt don't know what they're talking about. So I don't think it's possible to have a central repository when we can't even agree as a country on who is qualified to judge and who isn't qualified to judge. I think of the movie Hiroshima, in which an incident is replayed from 4 different perspectives. That is the way that journalists work. We're coming at it from a lot of different perspectives. We never actually get to the actual truth of what happened. We try to get there, but we don't actually get there. But to have a central repository, I don't think that's possible, and frankly, I don't think the First Amendment would allow for it.
All right. Good question from this side of the room. Oh, sorry, Diana.
I just wanted to say this goes back to the issue of revenue, though, and what kind of value are credible news sources capturing from this digital, disruption that's happening in media? Mm-hmm. And you'll see that there's 5 companies that right now are getting, none of which are, well, most of them are not providers of, news that's originally done for themselves. So it's the Facebooks of the world, Google, aggregators that are capturing 65% of digital ad revenues right now. And the rest is being devoted to organizations that actually are providing the reporters on the ground, that are paying those salaries to cover those important stories. Mm-hmm. So it's something important to kind of think about is how do you bring about the revenue that's needed to cover the important stories that are credible and that are fact-based.
And one thing, gentleman in the back, your question, but before that, just so you know, a Pew study on the state of the media in 2016 found that 62% of U.S. adults get their media from social media.
Wow.
Hi, Kai Wiggins with the Arab American Institute. What new role does citizen journalism play in, the coverage of global events, especially events that might pose complications to U.S. foreign policy? I think of Khan Shaykhun, which we saw footage coming from the sarin gas attacks, and that footage might have inspired President Trump to launch this airstrike on the Syrian airbase. So, what effect do, social media advancements and stuff have on this kind of dynamic?
It can be good and bad.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you just cited a perfect example. Sometimes it's hard for us to get into various hotspots, and we have to create, you have to build relationships with, fixers on the ground who know the area, who know how not to get killed, and be able to extract that video. But you also have to have the proviso when you put it on your air and say, look, this is how we got it. This is who provided to us. We cannot fully authenticate the, what you're seeing here, but some things are what they are. And so it's a very dicey proposition in some respects, but it's important, if it's not such a precarious situation, that you're trying to teach people what the standards are and what is a balanced story and things like that. Just opening up your smartphone does not mean you're committing journalism.
But when you have the preponderance of video, not just the one video that inspired the president to order the airstrike on the airfield, but the preponderance of videos coming from that incident. I had to look at all that video. There's a lot that didn't get on the air because it was incredibly gruesome, much more so than the Shabiha attacks of 2012 in Homs and in Hama. When you have that preponderance of evidence, and very quietly you have other governments saying something needs to be done before the UN can actually do its own sanctions, that does have an impact. But again, as Jeff said, you have to tell people, this is where we got it, this is who provided it to us, we can't independently verify it, but with the preponderance of videos that we have, we know something happened here. And you just have to be very honest with the viewers and with the readers about what they are seeing and reading. Governments usually don't move that quickly when they make these sorts of decisions. They usually have intelligence ahead of when we actually see this video that something happened. But certainly, this is perhaps the new version of someone calling the newsroom and saying, hey, I heard gunshots, over on this street, or you hear something on a police scanner that everyone's moving towards a certain area, or you hear that the fire department is going somewhere. This is the new version of that assignment desk phone or a police scanner. But people who are actually seeing it are saying, this is happening, this is important, I need you, the media, to pay attention to it. So certainly a lot of things that wouldn't have been paid attention to before Trayvon Martin are now being paid attention to, because people feel free to say, wait a minute, I'm seeing something that's not right, that doesn't fit our local norms, that is potentially illegal, and the media, love us or hate us, need to know about it, because they can then share with other people and see if our outrage is justified. So I think it's had, on the whole, a positive impact, because it means that we in the media are not stuck in our silos focused on the same 3 stories every day. We have people saying, no, pay attention to this. And sometimes it feels like it's 24 hours in a 10-hour day or an 11-hour day, but I think ultimately we are better as a profession, and that the people who watch us and read us are better served because we are trying to get more of the universe out to them.
One last question from this side of the room.
Hi, my name is Sasha Scott, and I wanted to ask you a bit about outreach to new audiences, and maybe even, I'm sorry to say, lost audiences in some cases, especially given everybody's earlier points about the need for diversity in so many different regards, whether it be race, country of origin, socioeconomic, whatever. What are some of the bridges that you guys like, going more from diagnosis to solution, if possible? What are some of the bridges that you guys like, maybe going over social media, or maybe like when Josh Rushing did his book, Mission Al Jazeera, that brought a lot of people from rural America maybe into the awareness that Al Jazeera wasn't a terrorist organization, that kind of thing. What are you guys doing outside of what you air on your own outlets to reach people? Maybe it's through comedy shows, like people learning through Jon Stewart and Bassem Youssef the first things about the Middle East they've ever heard in their lives that are more credible. What are you guys doing about that? And my second part of that would be, when you see outlets like Al Jazeera, America, Democracy Now! Having done really good journalism, obviously one of them no longer with us, what would you say are good, promising models, even if in other countries, for sustaining quality journalism?
Thank you. Jeff?
Well, at the risk of sounding horribly self-serving, the National Press Club has been doing that since 1908, building bridges and hosting forums to talk about what we do in the profession and how we do it, in addition to bringing newsmakers into our house and holding them accountable. So we definitely talk about the profession. We talk shop in addition to doing that. But to your second point, that's much harder. Yes, there are good models, but that also goes back to economics. You know, one of the biggest reasons why, AJAM went away was economics, one of the reasons. The rest are well publicized. So you're looking at what you want. At the end of the day, and this goes back to a point Rosalind raised, you have to demand what you want. You have to be able to say, I want this, and I'm willing to actively cultivate that viewing habit and tell your neighbors and have your neighbors tell their neighbors. Because at the end of the day, it's eyeballs. At least it's for television, and clicks if it's online and newspapers. Subscriptions. You have to be willing. There's people. Why do I have to pay to read this newspaper? Well, first of all, reporters have to be able to eat. And
they have mortgages.
They have mortgages.
Have children.
And children and so forth. So, we can't just give away the service. And so the viewer, the reader, the listener has a responsibility not only to vet the information, as we talked about earlier, but to have the right information, but they have to want to pay for that information. You pay for cable, you pay for whatever you want, and you have to pay for good journalism too.
If I can interject, I also think being an analyst, one of the things that's always been important to me is making sure that there are other voices in the room, and that those voices are actually heard, and also trying to reach out and move beyond just, because it seems like most media outlets like to use just maybe 1 to 5 people, and it's like, okay, this is like my team of people who we're going to use, and we're going to get them to speak on everything. And so one of the things that I'm always pushing for is saying, oh, here's someone who I think would be good to talk about this, or here's someone, in this particular place or country or what have you, that we're not hearing from, that I think would be really good in bringing a very different perspective. And so I think it's when we get in those rooms and now our voices are being elevated, that it's important to make sure that we're bringing additional voices of diversity of thought and ideas, and making sure that they're being pushed out there. And so I mean it's not a collective idea or notion, but it's something that I think individually that I think we, at least from my perspective, I'm mindful of, and making sure that we're pushing that out there.
Very quick last comments.
So from my perspective, I was a journalist. I got an MBA, and am really building out the Hill Latino as a business and as a sustainable business. And from that perspective, I can say that the industry as a whole has been experimenting with subscriptions, as you all mentioned. We're doing a lot of events in mobile. We just hired a new president of the company whose mission it is to scale our video services. But to your point about reaching out to new audiences and experimenting with other business models, I've built out an events business to sustain that journalism. And about a month ago, we launched the first Latino Leader Summit that we ever put together. There was such a hunger for that content because that audience, the Latino community, hasn't really been spoken to in this way about leadership in a very mainstream way. English language, forward. way, and the reception that we got was incredible. We had 250 people in the room, 55,000 live stream views. So there was an incredible thirst for this information and for this content, and it's also something that can drive revenue. So these are the kinds of things that we need to experiment with.
All right. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for joining us online.